Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. I am Laura Elliff Cruz, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am today's worship associate. Whoever you are, whomever you love, whatever your image of the holy, wherever you are in your life's journey, you are welcome here. If this is your first time with us, we'd love to get to know you. Please sign our guest sign-in book in the foyer. And for kids here in our service, we have the activity table up front. Kids can also stay seated with their grown-ups. Please remember just to use quiet and whisper voices while talking. And today, our nursery coordinator is on vacation, so if you would like a quiet room for your younger kiddos to play in and make noise, we have our library space, and you can still hear and see the service from there as well. Feel free to take toys from the nursery into the library space for your kiddos if that's needed. And your kiddos are always welcome to play up here in the Young Worshipers carpet area. And noises from young kiddos are always welcome as well. So we have our candles of community over here and in the back. You're encouraged to come up before the prayer meditation time to light a candle and write your joy or your sorrow in the book to read out loud.
We come together as a community every Sunday to pause and worship together. Worship creates connections within, among, and beyond us, calling us to live with wisdom and compassion, calling us to be our better selves. So our worship theme for this month of June, this last Sunday in June, our theme has been flourishing together. And we've had many pride-themed services this month. And today, Mimi Adams and myself are exploring this theme through the title, Stories That Bind Us, because we know that we flourish together in community when we share our stories with one another. So that is our theme for today's worship. So Laura is now going to read our chalice lighting words, and I'm going to light our chalice. And one fun fact about me is my favorite color is green.
We gather as one community, a community united by common ideals: love, justice, diversity, freedom, mutual care, equity. Yet look around. Look at all the faces of those around you. Each face represents an individual. Every one of us has our own story, needs, our strengths, and our faults. We light our chalice today honoring our common connection and also the uniqueness that lives within each of us.
was beautiful. Thank you. Humans, we have always connected, empathized, and thrived through sharing of stories. Just think of all the bedtime stories you were read or have read to young ones at night. Just think of all the stories you have told around campfires with friends and loved ones. Across all cultures, from ancient hunter-gatherer firesides to modern digital spaces, sharing narratives has been the primary way humans communicate values, build trust, and ensure group survival. Stories have bound us as a human species from the very beginning. And these stories have set us apart from other species. So you have heard of the binomial name for humans, Homo sapiens, right? The wise human. But have you heard, and you can raise your hand if you have, of the binomial name Homo narrans? Anyone? The storytelling human, our folklorist has. Yeah. The storytelling human. I kind of like this binomial name better, since we are indeed storytelling humans. And it has been through our storytelling that we have become wise. Which came first, the wise human or the storytelling human? I would like to think the storytelling human came first, but we can discuss that after church during coffee hour too. You can tell me what you think. We know religions are also based upon stories that are told and retold. Our Unitarian Universalist story of our flaming chalice is one of sanctuary, justice, and love. Our story of our symbol of the flaming chalice came about during World War II to help Jews, Unitarians, and others who were in danger of being killed by Nazi soldiers, and this symbol was used to help them escape. But more on that story in a bit. So today, Mimi and I are encouraging all of us here to tell our stories here in our community. Our personal stories, our communal stories that bind us together, all of our stories. Stories help us connect. When there is so much division in our world, it is our stories that help us realize connections over divisions. We can argue about beliefs, or we can connect and find similarities through story. I would rather find similarities and connections through story. So we are coming up to the 250th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence in this country. And this is another story that binds us all together here living in the U.S., and it is indeed a complicated story, but more on that story later as well. So today, Mimi and I are using a storytelling format that you all can follow to tell your story too. First stories, so that's the format. So first stories. So what are some of your first stories that you remember? Then questions. And then the story that binds us here in this space, Unitarian Universalism. Because it is indeed Unitarian Universalism that brings us all together here in this place. So just for your reference, I love hearing your stories, your life stories, how you came to Los Alamos, how you found UUism, how you met your partner, your kiddo and grandkiddo stories, your hiking and adventure and travel stories. You guys got some, I bet. Your tattoo stories, if you have those. I want to hear all of them. So let's start sharing our stories together today and beyond today. So first, stories. The first stories that impacted my life were those of the Bible. As a preacher kid, yep. Growing up as a Presbyterian preacher kid, these were the first stories I was taught. These were the first stories I remember really sticking with me. The Adam and Eve creation story and the Noah's Ark flood story are what I remember early on as a kid. These ones stuck with me even more so than stories about Jesus. I loved learning about how the heavens and earth were made because I felt connected to something greater, and there was some mystery there still for me. I also loved learning and hearing the story of Noah's Ark. I liked hearing how the animals were all saved 2 by 2, and this ark survived a massive flood. I always felt a little bad and a little sad for the people who drowned and didn't make it onto the ark, though. And at the end of this story, I really appreciated the dove who went out and found an olive branch, found some land, and the rainbow that appeared in the sky. The story ended with hope and a beautiful bow of colors in the sky and a promise that God would never flood the earth again. I really like this hopeful ending, and it has stuck with me to this day. I'm always looking for hope and holding on to hope. This hope-filled message impacted me enough that I even got it tattooed on my foot as my first tattoo, a dove with an olive branch and a rainbow. I was taught that God is love growing up, and this love teaching also has stuck with me into my adulthood. I also, of course, remember the stories being taught in elementary school of Columbus discovering America and the story of the Pilgrims and Native Americans sharing the first Thanksgiving. Luckily, as an adolescent, I learned that the stories I was taught from the book of Genesis in the Bible, the Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark story, were myths that we can draw inspiration from. The Columbus and Thanksgiving story, however, the realization that these stories were myths wouldn't come until later in adulthood. However, subconsciously, at a young age, in kindergarten, I think I knew that the Thanksgiving story was a myth, and what I was being taught was BS, because as we were doing our Thanksgiving crafts of making antiquated pilgrim hats and Native American feather headdresses, I threw up all over the crafts I was making. Those are my first stories, and now Mimi is going to share.
Hello. Okay. Sometimes it seems like my entire life is a garden of stories. I was born into Catholicism, and part of my baptism was a deluge of Bible stories poured into my ears and thoughts and mind. My grandparents, who lived within walking distance, kept a picture-filled children's Bible, dozens of picture books filled with Bible stories, as well as books with Christian-based stories. Some were actually really well written and illustrated and quite moving. But in my early child, two stories were the most important to me and my identity. Neither were written in books or illustrated by artists. My mom. My grandparents told me stories about how they first met my mom and the boy they adopted as her brother, Nick. How Mom and Nick lived with a woman, Mrs. Nicholas, who took care of them until my grandparents found them and took them to their home to be their own children. My mom had longer, bigger stories of what living with Mama Nicholas was like, about the multitude of brothers and sisters she had there. Some stayed a long time, some a very short time. Of her special best friend sister, Helen, another Indian girl who Mama had adopted, and how Mama hadn't been allowed to adopt her, my mother, but always called her my baby anyway. My daddy, Kirby Lynn Adams, came into my life when I was a toddler, younger than 2. I don't remember it, but I remember the story. When my mom decided to introduce us, she brought him to our apartment. He said, "Hi," to my brother and me. We took one look at him. We jumped up and ran into his arms, exclaiming, "Daddy!" He picked us both up at the same time and showered us with kisses. There was no formal proposal after that. It was simply a given that they would soon marry, and within a year they had done so. Throughout my life, the definition of family was not based on who shared which ancestors or percentage of blood, but rather the connections we lovingly choose and share stories about.
So in college and seminary, I began questioning the stories of my youth and questioning the myths of this country. Questioning is indeed a healthy thing to do in our lives. Ultimately, it is the questioning that would lead me to becoming Unitarian Universalist down the road. But I had to unpack my family story first. A family filled with Presbyterian educators and ministers. And it was at my Presbyterian seminary I started questioning the whole of the Bible and the authority of those scriptural texts. After my first year of seminary, I went off to do a chaplain internship in Boise, Idaho, where my dad had a seminary friend who served as a staff chaplain at the hospital. It was an intense summer. I was in my early 20s, and I had never experienced death before in my life. I was now seeing it all the time at this hospital, and I was trying to make sense of suffering. This is when I tattooed my theology at the time onto my foot, the rainbow, the dove with the olive branch. And I wrote a theological reflection about a visit I had had with a patient's mom whose kiddo was in the hospital. And I was to go over this reflection with my supervisor. I had a good supervisor who I liked, and I remember presenting this reflection to him about that visit. I used the Noah's Ark story as my theological reflection, that even in the midst of suffering and all the metaphorical floods in our lives, and describing the floods that this patient's mom had been through, there was always hope. This supervisor then told me my theological reflection was crap. This supervisor told me that I was crap and asked the question, what if for this mom who had their kiddo in the hospital, there was no hope in sight or no rainbow? Huh? What? I had no answer. No hope? Huh? I had never questioned my optimistic hope beliefs. I think this was the beginning of my crisis of faith and the unraveling of all the theological questions I thought that I had had answers to. This supervisor also gave me the permission to not be ordained in the Presbyterian tradition if I didn't feel like I had Christian beliefs. So I went back to seminary for my second year and stopped the ordination process in the Presbyterian Church. And I continued on my path of getting my Master of Divinity degree, diving into justice and interfaith work in the Princeton and wider New Jersey area. Also, during this crisis of faith, I ended up singing a lot of karaoke and even won a karaoke contest. So music, justice, and interfaith work were my outlets for my questioning and crisis of faith in my Christian-based seminary. The myths of this country became clear to me as well. Slavery, racism, genocide, sexism, all the isms. These were clear to me, yet I still had hope. Obama had just been elected president, and that hope-filled light was bright for our nation. We were starting to be truthful about the stories of this country. I was also starting to be truthful about my beliefs or non-beliefs. Questioning can be hard, but diving into these questions can lead us into greater truths for ourselves and for our communities. I now embrace the questions that come up in my life because I know that my growth is dependent upon asking these questions. There might not be answers, but I'm okay with that.
When I was sick, let me try again. When I was 6, my daddy grew very sick, and we didn't really know why. He'd already had terrible arthritis and used armband crutches to get around. He went to the hospital, had a surgery, a knee replacement, and came home and walked much better. Then it started. Infections, unexplained swelling, fatigue, pain, more infections. He went back to the hospital over and over and over again. Eventually, he just lived there. My brother and I almost never got to see him, but I remember long hours in the waiting room of the VA hospital in Albuquerque. Our storybooks were a staple to keep us quiet and entertained, and he simply got sicker no matter what they tried. One day, Mike and I were at our grandparents' house in their backyard, avoiding eating our potato pancakes for brunch. My grandparents went inside, and this song came on the radio called Just Remember I Love You. I suddenly felt dread, and a terrible sadness gripped me. The phone rang inside, and I heard my grandparents answer it, and I ran to the other side of the yard and tried to hide behind a tree. I was already crying by the time my grandparents came out. Their faces were tear-stained and delivered the news: your daddy died. There were never answers to how or why, just questions and misery. But it's okay. By the way, I have a dad who I love, and my brother loves very much. He's a grandpa to my son and my nibblings. I call him John because that's how I first knew him, but he's my dad. He and my mom were married for over 3 decades. There are stories there too, but they are not questioning stories, and over 3 decades worth of stories would have me up here talking at you for at least another 3 hours. But John is an integral part of some of my questioning stories. When I was 18 and off to college, my parents had an empty nest. I'm still in the nest, but they thought they had an empty nest. They took a long trip by car and drove up to British Columbia, Canada. I'm sure they did a lot of interesting things along the way, but what was the most important in my story is that they looked for my mom's original family. There was a barricade on the road into Mount Currie, the reserve where my mom was born. Mom and John did find one of Mom's cousins, Martin, but it was the weekend and the band office was closed, so they talked and he promised to look her up on Monday when the office reopened. He found her family. Her mother was Edith, and most of that side of the family had long passed. Only cousins remained, all of whom were just children when my mom disappeared. But a few weeks later, after my parents had returned home, my mom got a phone call. She had brothers and sisters and a still living father. They had looked for her when she was a child. Her search had been foiled by the Catholic Church, by the foster care system, by the courts, by her adoptive parents, my grandparents. But they had looked for her. They had wanted her back. She wasn't abandoned or unwanted. She was stolen. And she was one of many children removed, forcibly taken, or simply never given back when their parents died. I finally had answers about who I was. I also had many more questions about my family, about my country, both of them, about my nation, and about the history of my people, I did discover that I looked like my grandmother Edith.
So the questions I was asking in my Presbyterian tradition led me to wanting to be part of a more inclusive tradition. After seminary, I went to our National Presbyterian General Assembly, where we were arguing about love and allowing the ordination of people in the LGBTQ+ community. Arguing about this whole thing seemed ridiculous to me, because love is love is love is love. Woo! And I was taught that God's love is the most inclusive love of all. One of those first stories I was taught. So I questioned why we were arguing about this. And when I found the Unitarian Universalist tradition, the stories I heard were that this tradition has been ordaining and marrying people of the LGBTQ+ community since 1977. Woo! I think that's awesome. I also heard the story from our Universalist tradition that Olympia Brown had been the first ordained woman in the United States in 1863, y'all. Woo! I also read our UU principles and values and knew that I could fully be who I was in this tradition, even if I was questioning my ever-evolving faith beliefs. It is here in this UU tradition where I truly feel free to explore and express my story and who I am now. Maybe a lot of you resonate with that. I still hold love at my center, and I hold on to inclusion and drawing the circle wider, and I hold on to the questions and the ever-evolving answers, and I hold on to hope. One of the stories of our UU faith that has impacted me deeply is the story of our symbol of this flaming chalice. Hey guys, welcome. Ultimately, this is the symbol of my faith now. And I have tattooed it on myself in 3 different forms. This symbol, like I said earlier, came about in World War II, as I mentioned, and during this war, it was during this war that the Unitarian Service Committee was formed to help people in danger from the Nazis. The director of the service committee was the Unitarian minister Charles Joy, and Reverend Joy was living in Portugal and was in charge of a secret group of agents and messengers who worked hard trying to find safe routes for people to escape. Reverend Joy and his assistants often needed to ask governments and other organizations for their help to save people who were in danger. Because they were a new organization, not very many people had heard of them. And this made it much harder for the Unitarian Service Committee to get the help they needed. So often people were escaping from the Nazis, and people who wanted to help didn't speak the same language. So Reverend Joy decided it would be much better if the service committee had an official symbol or picture to help identify its members. With a picture or symbol, it wouldn't matter if people couldn't read the language. So Reverend Joy would need to find an artist. And he went to a very talented man named Hans Deutsch for help. Deutsch had escaped from the Nazis in Paris, France, where he was in danger because he drew cartoons showing people how evil the Nazis were. Reverend Joy asked Deutsch to create a symbol to print on service committee papers to make them look important. For his drawing, Deutsch borrowed an old symbol of strength and freedom from Czechoslovakia, a chalice with a flame. Reverend Joy wrote to his friends in Boston that the new symbol seemed to show the real spirit of the Unitarian religion. It showed a chalice or a cup that was used for giving a healing drink to others, and it showed a flame on top of the chalice because a flame was often used to represent a spirit of helpfulness and sacrifice. And so, the flaming chalice became the official symbol of the Unitarian Service Committee, and that's the symbol they used right there. Many years later, the flaming chalice became the symbol of Unitarian Universalist groups all over the world and is now lit in the beginning of our worship services together. For me, this symbol is a symbol of hope, light, love, justice, protection, healing, and sanctuary for all. And right now in my life, I find solace and hope in our Unitarian Universalist faith. Even when things seem a bit darker, I continue to hold that hope and love and continue to look for the rainbows, even if it seems overwhelming. And I would tell my chaplaincy supervisor today that my theology of hope is not BS, but ultimately is one of my core faith beliefs. Yes, I can sit with pain and suffering, but I do believe there is still the hope in the love that we can share with each other through our pain. So no, my rainbow hope-filled and love-filled optimism is not BS. Woo! I wonder what my supervisor would say now to that. So sharing our stories can help us get through our hard times, because it is indeed through our stories that we are able to find similar threads and express our compassion and empathy towards one another.
By the way, I always forget to turn this on. By the way, whoa, now what happened? Ah, there we go. That kitty on John is Cosmos. My dad, John. I love him so, so much. That will be relevant in a little bit. UU values and history pervade my life. I actually seriously considered going to seminary to become a UU minister. I took different roads, but being a Unitarian Universalist is probably part of the very core of my identity. It is my dad who brought us to the UU church. After Daddy died, my mom eventually joined a few singles groups. In one of them, she met this incredibly handsome guy named John Fawcett. They talked a little, and he suggested that she try his church, the very same one where the singles group was meeting, the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, and so she agreed. So the next Sunday, she bundled us up in our usual Sunday finery for when we went to the Catholic church, and in we waltzed, far more decked out than anybody else. She looked around for John, and he wasn't there that Sunday. It wasn't the most auspicious of beginnings, but they became good friends, good partners, and finally a really good married couple. I always think of it as the story of when my dad joined our family. And that makes it sound a lot smoother and easier than it was, but it is one of the most important parts of my story. Among the many gifts my dad brought us was this church, this religion, this system of values and faith, and being in the world. It was in this faith that I first ever told the story, which has become my signature story. I seem to have skipped a slide. Oh, there it is. How Raven brought daylight to the world. And it is in this church and this faith that I have most often shared that story. It was as a part of this faith when I started learning more about my Lilwat family and my people and our own traditional stories. The values of my own Lilwat people were easy to understand: connection, compassion, community, consensus, because they are so integral to the values mirrored in the UU faith. I had wrapped myself in. Kulchum, to harvest. Take what you need, use what you take, share what you have, gather together. If my life is a garden of stories, I have a rich harvest indeed. Among that harvest, my dear friends, my dear community, my dear family, is you. Kulchum. Together we gather and nourish ourselves and each other. Together we gather and share ourselves and our stories. Our harvest is bountiful and beautiful. Kulchum.